And I expect Courtney to jump back on, but let's at least get introductions out of the way. And this is the Finance Committee of the Maine Recovery Council. I am Benjamin Mann, the Deputy Commissioner of Finance at the Department of Health and Human Services. I also serve as the Treasurer of the Maine Recovery Council. I'll go over to Pat.
Good afternoon. My name is Pat Kimball. I am a recovery advocate, retired, and I am the current chair of the Maine Recovery Council. And I'm going to turn it over to Representative Kraft.
Good afternoon. I'm Lydia Crafts. I live in Newcastle and serve House District 46. I'm also a clinical social worker. I'll turn it to Paul.
Hello, I'm Paul Vinsel, addiction medicine physician working for Spurwink and at the family medicine residency at Central Maine Medical Center. And I'll turn, I don't know who goes next. Miles? I'll go with Miles.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, my name is Miles Willett. I'm a clinical supervisor at an outpatient facility in Aroostook County. I'm also someone with lived experience and someone who was directly affected by the opioid epidemic. And I will pass it over to Courtney.
Can you hear us?
Did you say me? Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Courtney Gary Allen. I'm the organizing director of MeRAP and a person with living experience of substance use. I don't know if anyone is left.
Let's go to Recovery Council staff. Brendan.
Hi, I'm Brendan O'Neill. I'm Assistant Attorney General in the Maine Attorney General's office. Haley.
Haley Tranco with the Attorney General's office.
Hi, I'm Ella Capin. I'm with the Attorney General's office.
Hi, I'm Mary Coyne. I'm the coordinator for the Recovery Council.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining this afternoon. Just a couple housekeeping notes. We will, the Finance Committee meetings will be 90 minutes, so we'll go to 2:30. I do have a hard stop at 2:30, so we'll be signing off then. And the agenda for this meeting can be found in the link that I just put in the chat if you don't have it up already. Haley, I'm going to want to share my screen, so if you could give me privileges to do that, I would appreciate it. But the agenda, I'll do a quick budget update, and then we have several implementation topics, including next steps around and updates around contracts, the budget component to the application that is under development, discussion around admin costs. I think we will jump to discussion around a potential hiring a potential vendor to help us administer and manage the council. There are a couple other agenda items that time permitting we can get to. Any other comments, questions, announcements before we dive into the agenda?
I just have one quick one, Ben. I have to leave at 2:15.
Okay, so we have
Thank
Miles
you.
at 1:50, Pat at 2:15, and everyone at 2:30. Good. I will just say the current balance at the end, I don't have the balance for April yet. I will next week, I presume, but as of the end of March, the balance in the account was just under $19.2 million. That includes all expenses to date, obviously incoming distributions from settlements, and then also interest accrued. That can be, and we have our spreadsheets that are on the OAG's website as well, which don't tie exactly to that number, but are close. I think what makes sense is I will plan on going through our overall budget again. There have been some changes. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I want to make sure that folks have just the latest on this. That 19 million, I'll use the verb commit. We have committed $9 million, but we have not spent it. So that $9 million is still sitting in our account. So that is not what our available balance to spend is. That's exactly what I will sort of go through here with you. So I spent a little bit of time to update the tracker, and I think it is it's improved. It looks similar, but it's just using current information on everything. And I will plan, I did this late last week, and but we'll plan on sending it out ahead of time so you all have it ahead of these meetings, which I realize is probably more useful than seeing it now. So you can see, I'll just orient you to the spreadsheet again. You can see year 1, year 2, year 3, all the way out. It also has the calendar years underneath that in row 3. We have the estimated payments. It should actually say actual or estimated payments. We've talked, and you all are aware, that the year 2 actual of $2.9 million was far less, but the year 3 was much greater. It was just a delay in the distributions. So the cumulative amount after 3 years, or at the end of this calendar year, is going to be very close to what we originally were anticipating. I think we were anticipating 35 million, and this is 36 million. I will just feel free to raise your hand, or preferably just interrupt me if you have questions or comments as we go along. The budget that we approved, that we recommended to the council and approved, was in row 9 here in the medium bluish color. That included $15 million this calendar year and another 15 million in year 4. It decreases over time. And we had tentatively, we had sort of broken apart that $15 million budget into ongoing and one-time funding amounts of 15. So in addition to that budget, well, in addition to the distributions, I should say, there's interest payments that we had, and and here's the section for interest. We collected $525,000 in fiscal 2023 off of interest. The actuals to date for the first 3 months of this calendar year is $181,000. And I have just made an estimate of interest for the rest of the year and plugged it in here. I will say, I don't want to budget down to the penny or dollar, or even probably hundreds of thousands of dollars. We will track it as such, but just for example, that interest payment is, I had to make some guesses about when we would distribute the funding that we already committed. That is millions and millions of dollars. Obviously, our interest payments will decline after we make those distributions, and they will obviously be not generating interest in our account. So that is subject to a bunch of assumptions there. So I just wanted to highlight that. I don't like using figures like $485,618 as an estimate, because it seems very precise, and it is like that precision is misleading. I do think it is directionally probably accurate, though. So the next section here, you can see I called it the December 2023 funding decisions. I'm not going to review this in detail. You all are aware of this. And split over year 1 and year 2. Admin,
Hey
Again,
Ben, sorry to interrupt you, but with the recovery support one decisions from December, did we increase that decision?
yes, thank you. I did not update that. So that went up slightly based on our last council. I need to add that in. I realized that like just a little bit ago.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for highlighting that.
Does anyone remember? I think it was like 500,000, wasn't it?
Yeah, I believe it was an extra 150 to 175,000 from the original. That sounds about right, Courtney.
I will update that and send it around so we can get it, so you all have it. Admin costs, again, we have a prior year actuals, and then we have actuals through for January, February, and March. You can see that's about $35,000. And then I made an estimate of costs as well. I actually, this one's even a little bit more of a educated guess than the interest, since I presume our admin costs will increase at an increasing rate here, but that's obviously subject to council decisions and how we treat things here. But just wanted to plug in some placeholders for admin costs. The school set aside amount is below here. You can see it's just an annual 3% of the distributions coming in. It's a pretty straightforward calculation. And then I just added the catch-up school set aside amounts there. So there's different ways to represent the school set aside. Obviously, we're going to be spending it, but it also feels like a requirement. So it's you know, I don't want to get hung up on that too much, but just wanted to acknowledge that there. So taking into account the three main buckets of funding that we have set aside, which is the funding decisions made, admin costs, and the school set aside, we have we're obligated to spend 7.5 million, and that leaves about 8.5 million this year available. And then you can see there's another 12.5 million or so for next year as well. Those are both based off of our original budgets of $15 million total for 2024 and 2025. Questions, comments? Thank God.
Yeah, Ben. So just to confirm, the money that we have committed now, recently, that reflects on that 8.3 that was just in the in that you had up. So we will have another 12 to commit for the year 2024. Is that correct?
We have 8.6 for the balance of this calendar year and 12.5 in calendar year 2025, which next year.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Certainly. I will work with on how we want to display this. I don't know if these go up on the website or not. There is information about travel reimbursements and people's names in this budget and everything. So I will work with maybe Brendan on exactly if we should just provide, I think it's important to provide the summary level data, but not necessarily all financial information at a micro level, but we can discuss that offline. Any other questions on this, Courtney?
I'm sorry if this is already on the agenda. I am opening it now, but is there time to discuss what this committee believes should be the allocation? If there's about $21 million over the course of the next 2 years, one of the questions in the grants committee was, how is that distributed across the pillars?
Yes, that is on the agenda. We can have a brief let's get to that in a
That's
little.
fine. I needed to open the agenda. Sorry about that, Ben.
All good. It is 3D on the agenda. I will, just a couple other updates. The governor's budget included transfers or the authority to transfer funding from the Maine Recovery Council to DHHS is what I briefed the council on some months ago, but that was included and passed. So should the council choose to do so, we now have the authority and can actually transfer funding to DHHS. I will say, with the caveat, not until the budget is effective, because the budget was not passed on an emergency basis. In other words, on a bipartisan basis, it is only effective 90 days after the adjournment of the legislature. The legislature has not adjourned yet. So we do not know the effective date of the budget, but it will likely be sometime in August. I will also say, based on some prior conversations that happened at the council, I am facilitating some conversations with state agencies about transfers to other departments, just so we understand if the council should want to do that, such as Maine State Housing. Maine State Housing is only a quasi-public organization, so they have fewer restrictions on them as opposed to DHHS. So there might be some more flexibility in them. I'm not suggesting we are transferring any money to Misha, but I'm figuring out the process should we want to sometime in the future. So I'm working with the Department of Administration and Administrative and Financial issues on that. Okay, that's the budget update. Let's go to Brendan and update on contracts. I think we spent the majority of our time last time talking about the recovery support contract and some other pieces. But Brendan, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. And it seems like you guys can probably hear the background noise here. There's drilling happening on the exterior of my building. So if that becomes unmanageable, let me know and we can, reorder or try to do things differently. And if I'm speaking too loudly as a result, you can tell me about that too. My focus right now is on the Piscataquis contract. As some of you may know, we have a new finance director in our office, and I'm working with that person to, prepare for that distribution. I had intended to have for this meeting, but I anticipate having shortly after this meeting a draft of a contract with the center to circulate to this group, and that's going to be based on the recovery wellness folks. It's going to be based on drafts of recovery center contracts that have been shared with me from Gordon, and other materials that Mary has pulled together for me. So I think that contract I'm pretty close to having ready for input. There's a couple of pieces that I need to shore up and a couple of conversations internally I need to have about that. That's the priority contract on my plate, in addition to other ones and other matters I'm working on for the Attorney General. The next thing that I think is the priority, that's my understanding, is the contracts with the SSPs. And I want to circle back to the discussion about the transfer authority to DHHS, because I had thought that the SSPs and the detox centers were meant to be one idea was that those could be part of that or related to that transfer authority. And so if that's transfer authority doesn't become effective until August. So first, I guess I need to better understand what my expectations are about those two areas, the SSPs and the detox centers, in terms of the extent to which DHHS is going to be involved in that work, and the role the council might have with that. Mary, you and I talked about contracts on Tuesday. Were there other contract matters that I thought we had talked about? I have a email appointment, or I've sent an email to Liz Blackwell Moore to talk about her work on treatment. But that's sort of like that's in my near term of the issues that I'm focused on.
Yeah, and the other contracts that we discussed that were on deck were the two youth prevention organizations.
Right.
And I've been in touch with both of them, and my hope is that Peter Alfond, I don't believe, has a state contract, but Maine Youth Action Network does, and I don't know if that's through I don't know if that's through them specifically or if they're part of a parent organization, but I think that will be a fairly straightforward contract. The biggest question still to be answered for those are really around the admin rates, which we're discussing today. And then they also have questions about the reporting requirements, which is a separate conversation from this. But yeah, if we can have a discussion, really set what our standard is for the indirect and admin rates, then I think we're in a pretty good place to move forward with those two contracts.
Let's go Pat, Paul, then Courtney, and I also have some thoughts.
So mine just quick. My thought was in regards to the SSPs that we talked about the flex dollars. And there's some things in the state contract that prevent them from using some of that money for where they would like to use it for flex dollars. And for me, I don't have any objection to being added to a state contract as long as the SSPs have the freedom to do what they need to do with those flex dollars. And again, someone more knowledgeable can answer that, but I know that we had conversation that part of the thing is the state had requirements on some of the funding that they were going to use. And I just want to make sure they get to use the flex dollars where it's needed the most.
Well, thanks, Pat.
My question is the same as Pat's, except that I don't know what she means by flex dollars.
That's the money that we allotted was so the SSPs had flexibility to use the money however they chose.
Okay, so you're talking
that's
about
just a word that, yeah.
Okay, I had never heard that term. Okay.
Yeah.
Same, my question was the exact same as Pat's.
Mine is, I'm adding a third to that. So I remember the conversation being general fund dollars or flex money. And also I've spoken with the SSPs. I just called Chastity real quick. The SSPs really do not feel comfortable with it going through the state funding because of those exclusions and what they can use state general funds for, and would much rather prefer a direct contract with the Maine Recovery Council to ensure that our intention of the funding is what can happen with the funding. Regarding the treatment dollars, I think we should give $1.5 million to DHHS to figure out how to put an RFP out for Lewiston or that county, Androscoggin County detox. Maybe we can do a direct contract with the one in the town of Washington from the Maine Recovery Council, but if DHS can do that, I think that we should let them do that because they've been doing that for a long time. The Mayan one is through TOA, the Opportunity Alliance. They do have a state contract. I would be fine with that if if Beth at my end's fine with that. If we just give money to DHHS to add to their state contract.
Thanks, Courtney. I will, my thoughts, and I'll go back to you, Paul, are generally in alignment with all of you. My recollection is, and it was sort of independent of the transfer authority ability, but I think it'd be the best course of action for the Maine Recovery Council to put contracts in place with the syringe service providers directly. With the language that I think we talked about, that the Maine CDC, which administers the syringe service program for the state, will be have some coordination. We'll have coordination and management, or help manage the contracts from a monitoring and oversight perspective from that. That was I think best. And for treatment as well, for the two SUD residential treatment bed allocations that we made, I do think with the new transfer authority, DHHS can run that procurement process on behalf of the Recovery Council and then actually award the contracts, so that they would be, if the council's comfortable, and I recall it, I think folks were, pending a few things, they would actually be DHHS contracts administering Maine Recovery Council funding. Those couple things that I think were left to be decided are such as, like, who's sitting on a scoring panel to determine who wins awards and things like that. That is an optimistic place to be. I think I would welcome having those conversations, because we don't have a huge number of folks coming in to provide these services already. So we sort of take what we can get a little bit on that front. Paul? You're on mute.
I'm going to put my hand down. I meant to put it down.
Other thoughts from folks on contracts? Okay.
Yeah, I want to circle back to the SSPs. And when I've been talking to Carolina, and she's invited me to attend the monthly meetings that they have, so that when we do the oversight and management of that, that's something that I, as the contractor, feel like I'll be in a good position to do. We also haven't touched much on the 200,000 that was allocated for the startup funding. And I don't know if this is the time and place to do that, but I wonder if that 200,000 could be transferred to the CDC directly through the transfer, and that way that money could be used by them either as a pool of money that they can then pull from to support organizations as they see fit, or through a process by which the council is also involved in that. I just wanted to make mention of that, because it hasn't been discussed and was not included in our initial discussions around 75,000.
You're on mute too.
So just a clarification, Mary, the 200,000, wasn't that meant for new SSPs that Gordon said were already in the pipeline?
It was. And I had spoke to Carolina about an SSP that I believe, and I may have this information wrong, so I'll follow up about it, was certified in January. But as far as I know, the amount that they're requesting is not 200,000. So then the question came up around, okay, does this need to be allocated to one SSP organization, or can this be looked at as more a pool of money that the CDC now has, so that when certification applications are received, they have the discretion and hopefully the ability to award more of those. Does that answer your question?
Courtney?
My question was, the one that was certified in January, I'm pretty sure is, I can't remember their name, but they're in Bangor. And
The needlepoint.
yes,
Needlepoint.
there we go.
Okay.
They're in Bangor, and Willie is the executive director. So Needlepoint. So, are they the one that you're talking about that would tap the 200,000, or are they already included in the $75,000 general funding?
And again, I will confirm this, but the discussion initially came up between Carolina and I around Needlepoint receiving that 200,000. And as of now, they are not included in that 17 existing. But the way that we had move forward with that motion in December was that we would have 17, right, SSPs getting that 75,000 now, and then next year we would have 18. So based on the language of that
I think
motion,
that we should move 75,000 out of the 200,000 to this year, so that Needlepoint gets their money, 75,000 this year and next year, and then we have 125,000 that I think can go to CDC. I'm talking out loud, but I haven't figured that out yet. But I think we should decrease the 200,000 to make sure Needlepoint gets their 75 this year and next year.
I like that idea.
I think if you read the motion, if you go back and read the motion, I think they are included.
okay.
I mean, it doesn't say who they are. It
Well,
just,
there was 17, we said 17. So were there 17 in December and then they came on board and were the 18th, or?
I think the motion said 17 plus another one. I think the motion included the new one. I'll go back, Mary and I'll research it.
Yeah.
But I think it was included in that motion, but I'm in favor of it either way.
Now I'm just guessing, but I've just looked up the funding allocations, and it is $75,000 less in year one than in year two. So I think at least the amount of funding that's in our sort of documented tracker for this seems to suggest what Mary said is true, that they were not included in year one and were included in year two, but we should run this down. And I do think, I like the idea of, if they're up and running, including them in year one and then using the balance, which would be $125,000 for other burgeoning SSPs.
And then I guess my other question, now that I've thought through giving the money to CDC for emerging syringe service programs, can we just keep it and they can come ask us when they have an emerging one? Because we don't want to give them our money because of their restrictions. So I think I've now talked myself into just keeping it in a funding line, and we have it for the next emerging one, and they can come ask us for it when it comes up. What do others think?
I like that better.
And it's also consistent with, if the Maine Recovery Council is going to put contracts in place with syringe service providers in the first place, that would make it consistent with that approach anyway. So it would be an extra contract for us to figure out as a Maine Recovery Council, but I think it makes sense from that perspective as well. So I think we can, anything else on that topic? I think we can do a little research, but it sounds like we're in general agreement on the approach there. Brendan, did you have questions, concerns, comments on this? You sort of teed up the agenda item here.
We're still on 3A? Yeah. No, on the SSPs, thank you, that's helpful. I'll probably circle back at some point in the future about the 125,000, although I'll talk with Mary about that, just to make sure, I have clarity about that. But thank you. That's helpful about the 18, $75,000 each in this year. And I'll work on those contracts.
Very good.
Sorry, Ben, just one more point on that, and this is a point of clarification. Will we need to have a vote to change that motion at all at the next council meeting? Because now if we're awarding, how we're allocating that 200,000, or because it was a separate kind of fund, can we use that at our discretion?
So I would research it first, and if you think it needs an adjustment, bring it to the next full council, and Ben can add that to his finance report and we'll vote. But I'd research to see what the original motion said first.
Okay.
And if you don't think it includes it, then it needs to be added.
I think, well, just to put a slightly finer point on it, if it directed the DHHS to award the contracts, then I think we need a motion. If it didn't, and if it was just vague, and if it made $200,000 available for startup funding for new SSPs, and it was silent on the administration and management of it, I don't think we would. But
Do you guys want me to read
we
it?
want to cross our T's and dot our I's.
Do you want me to read it?
Sure.
The Maine Recovery Council approved $75,000 for 17 different syringe service sites in Maine in year one, totaling $1.275 million in year one, as well as $200,000 in startup funding for any new syringe service site that becomes available in Maine. Furthermore, the motion approves $75,000 for 18 sites, totaling $1.35 million in year two.
Thank you, Haley. My interpretation of that is we are square and don't need further motions to enact what we just discussed. Courtney?
Can I also just put a slightly finer tuning on the contracting? If it's the will of the group, I would also like the SSPs to get their funding upfront, like not a spend and bill plan. Either a year of funding or 6 months, whatever the council feels comfortable with, but not like a reimbursement contract.
I agree. Yeah, you want it, you don't want it a fee for service. You want them to be able to have the money up front. Yeah. I think unless there's some reason legally we can't do it, the whole idea of this funding is to make it available. And these organizations don't have a lot to spare.
And I believe that was also one of the major reasons why we wanted to move forward with independent contracts, so that we didn't have to use the state's payment plan.
The words out of my mouth. I will, I'm supportive of that as well. I will say it's if it was a dollar figure much larger than $75,000 for an annual basis, I might suggest that we break it up into quarters or at least semi-annually, but with $75,000, I don't have any concerns about that. Do you have something else, Courtney, or did you not put your hand down? Great. Do we trying to anticipate any other decisions, or Brendan, did you want to talk about process once the contract is complete, or is the council, are we just going to go ahead and figure out who signs the contract and put it in place? Are you planning on sending it around to the council for review? Are we going to need to do a final vote on it or anything? I just want to make sure we're trying to anticipate any logistical steps here so that we can get the funding out to providers and folks since we're getting close here.
Yeah,
I hadn't contemplated that. I'm happy to talk about that in the next council meeting or offline as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I had anticipated there's a couple of procedure things that I need to ask questions about internally and make sure that, we have, our process and internally, squared away. Things like who signs the contract and so forth. what I anticipated doing was circulating contracts to this group for review. You know, at the moment, I anticipate circulating every contract to this group for review. We don't have yet kind of a standard contract, and I think each of the groups of contracts we've talked about are sufficiently different that, you know, I do want this group to look at them to make sure that it captures what people intend. And I also think there's expertise in this group that is necessary and helpful for this process. So at a minimum, I do plan to do that. And some of them, the Piscataquis is a faster timeline. I need to get that to this group very quickly. But in general, you know, I'm trying to build in enough lead time so that this group can review them and get, you know, get any issues that you identify squared away. I think what I'm leery of is receiving, you know, 6 or 7 or 8 different red lines with comments of the same contract and trying to square it all. I think, you know, we're a skeleton crew here. We're trying to, you know, get all this work done, and I think it would be most helpful to, you know, to have any changes or you know, comments or things like that handled in a more centralized way.
Very good. Paul?
I'm just for my clarification, when we talk about these contracts with the SSPs and with Piscataqua Recovery Center, is that different and separate from the grant application that Mary's been working on? So these SSPs are not going to have to apply for a grant in order to get the money. Is that correct?
That's my understanding. So the council sort of approached this process twofold. We wanted to get funding up and out, and allocated that 9 million plus in December, and then concurrently with working on a application process to accept other interested parties for delivering services across the spectrum of the work that we're doing. So it is both and not, and they wouldn't have to reapply. Okay, I'm going to sum up, Mary.
I'll wait. Go ahead.
Right. I'm just so we're all on the same page, and then I'd like to move on. The Piscataquis Recovery Center contract is going to be a contract out of the Maine Recovery Council. The SSP contracts are going to be a Maine Recovery Council for operations, and will include contract language that will lend DHHS support just for those ongoing contracts. The Maine Recovery Council this is actually a good piece for Paul's comment here, we'll figure out a process for the other startup funding for SSPs. That could be through an application, for example, or I think it probably makes sense through the application process, but those will be Maine Recovery contracts as well. Maine Recovery Council contracts for the startup funding, that 200,000, which will be reduced to 125,000 pending a few confirmations. The two $1.5 million SUD treatment bed funding allocations, DHHS will lead on those from the procurement process perspective, funding transfers from the Maine Recovery Council, and then also putting contracts in place. Those two would be for Androscoggin and Washington counties. And then I think I have this right, that it'll potentially likely be a DHHS contract for TOA for the prevention piece, and then it'll be a Maine Recovery Council contract for Peter Alfond, since DHHS doesn't have any contracts with Peter Alfond to my knowledge. Courtney?
The only caveat I will say is that with the treatment money, we switched it to 1.5 to Androscoggin County, 400,000 to planning in Franklin.
Yes.
and something else, some other number to the town.
1.1 million to the Tessa Lee Libby Foundation.
And I'm fine with, if it's the will of the group or with feedback, I'm fine with DHHS taking care of everything related to that. I don't need to score those applications or anything like that's well above my pay grade. Somebody else does that.
Let me take that as a follow-up, because if the Recovery Council is directing the funding to particular groups, I just have to keep in mind state procurement laws and rules, and that we might get a little crossways with that. It's not a no, but I just would like to follow up about the process on that. Mary?
Yeah, would the committee be comfortable if I just touch base with Maine Youth Action Network before we decide to move forward with our funding under the state's contract? I just want to make sure that that works for Beth, and if we're already doing a separate contract for Peter Alfond, I wonder if it would be not too overly complicated to sort of duplicate that for Maine Youth Action Network. So if everyone's okay with it, I'm just going to touch base with her before we mentally move forward.
Yeah, I tried to caveat that one a little differently than the other ones. I do think that one requires just a little bit more follow-up, and there's probably some implications about the state doing it versus or DHHS doing it rather than the Recovery Council.
Okay, great. And I will let you all know.
And there's also potentially timing aspects. I mean, first, like the budget effective date, and then also it takes time for DHHS to do things.
Yeah, and I think the impression for some of that funding was that it was hoped to be used sort of as flex funds, that they could, fill in the gaps where they felt like they needed to further their programs, especially when it comes to opioid specific prevention work and substance use prevention work. So just with all that in mind and with our reporting requirements and whatnot, I'll check in with them.
I think Franklin County and Tessa Lee Libby Foundation were both thinking they would receive the money before August as well. So it might not work with that timeline.
The budget kind of throws a wrench in all of it, the budget effective date.
Throws a wrench into everything that I was planning on doing in my day job too, but Paul?
I just want, just for the minutes, to make sure I get it right. I got the SSPs and the Piscataqua County contract will come out of the MRC. And the DHHS contract potentially is with TOA or with the Peter Alfond Fund?
It would definitely not be for Peter Alfond. To my knowledge, we have a contract with them. It would only be potentially for the TOA contract on the prevention.
Right, potentially. Okay, perfect. I got it right then.
Okay, anything else on contracts? Very good. Let's go to the budget component for the application process. I'll turn it over to Mary.
Great, thank you. So back in March, we had all discussed as a full council what the grant application could look like. The Program and Grants Committee is looking at that in more detail and is currently working through the letter of intent. Fingers crossed, our meeting tomorrow, we can move forward with a final recommendation for what that will look like, which will come to the full council on the 9th. But as part of the process with both the letter of intent and looking more holistically at the grant application, the budget component is obviously a huge piece, and the Program and Grants Committee is looking to the Finance Committee for guidance on best practice and recommendations for what's included in the grant application. I think there'll be changes that happen. Again, especially because we don't have the letter of intent finalized as of right now. But I was hoping we could discuss the general skeleton of what the budget template would look like to be included in the grant. And if there were any recommendations from this committee that could be shared tomorrow and definitely on the full council meeting in regards to this application, that would be helpful. So I will pull up what I shared. This is the document that I shared with the full council back in March. Okay. Can everyone see this?
You could zoom in a little bit or a lot.
How's that?
Even a couple more clicks would be good. That's great.
Okay. So it's a fairly straightforward version of a budget template, looking at staffing, admin costs, base budget, and then overhead costs. I went ahead and started to play around with what the description of each of these would be. But I think if the goal of this discussion from my perspective would really be for the committee to discuss what the expense categories are that they would like included in the grant. And then as well as any attachments or documentation that should be provided. I also want to mention that the way that we're moving forward right now with the grant, as a reminder to everybody, is we're going to have the letter of intent and then sort of a base grant skeleton. And then for larger projects that are asking for more funding, and that actual amount is still be determined. But for those projects, there would be essentially supplemental questions specifically related to the budget, so that we could have more information, again, when we're giving out more money. So the way that I'm looking at this budget template is for the general grant application. So please keep that in mind. If there are very specific questions, again, for particular instances of funding, those would be a separate part of this process. So yeah, Ben, I don't know if you want me to lead this or if I can turn it over to you to kind of help lead us through what this looks like and is needed.
Maybe you could just orient us to how it's currently constructed and we can just walk through it.
Yes. So as I mentioned, the left-hand side is the expense categories. And the expense categories, because they are pretty general, will need good descriptions and thorough descriptions here. I've started to include what I've pulled from other budget templates that could be included. And that's where this description and narrative column comes in. And then on the right-hand side, my recommendation would be that, we ask applicants the cost associated for each of the different categories within this description and narrative. And then also including the total. So the council had that information to pull from, looking at this budget on a yearly basis, unless you all think otherwise. And then here for the other costs, looking at supplies, administrative costs, indirect costs, the total for all of that. And then also the base budget would, from my perspective, include both these staffing costs and the other costs, and then any overhead costs as well, infrastructure, all of that. May not be necessary to include, but when thinking about ensuring that this funding is being used towards appropriate purposes, obviously we don't want it going to infrastructure costs and things like that that are not approved. So that was a part of including this as well. And then a total. So that was the brief overview. Can I answer any questions just on that skeleton so far?
Thanks, Barry. Pat, do you have a question?
Yeah, so here's my question. I'm assuming this is program specific, not agency specific. So if I'm a large agency and I'm only applying for funds, this is program specific. I also would, if some way in this budget, and maybe just me, is the whole project being funded by this money, or are there other sources of revenues that are adding to this project. So again, I have this project, I have funding from here, and the funding from the council will just assure that I can do all of this.
Mhm.
I don't know, maybe it's just me, but again, are we the only source of your funding for this particular project, or are there other sources that you're banking on?
Yeah, that's a great recommendation.
Yeah, I like that too. And it's like, my first one's more in the arts and crafts bucket. I do think we should probably turn this into a spreadsheet or a fillable PDF, because we don't want free form responses and us trying to like decipher things. So I think I would work, and I can help on this. I do a lot of work on spreadsheets, so I would default to a spreadsheet on this. And the sort of the top line could be like total estimated project costs, and then it could just be like percentage of request of the total project costs that the application is asking for. And then, so if it's $10 and they're asking for 50% of the cost, their budget should total to $5, which is, so it's sort of just arithmetic going down. And I think we can make these into more specific fields for prospective applicants to put in dollar amounts of what they're asking for.
Okay.
Any other thoughts? I mean, generally, I think this is good. The staffing versus non-staffing is, at the highest level, the division of expenses that I think we should be asking about. I think the council might be curious about, if they have to hire new staff to do this, or if they are carving it into their existing staff. If they have to hire new staff, that is something that could take a while, and would suggest to me that they're going to underspend their budget, because they're not going to start the hiring process until they get affirmation from us that they've received it. And we know what the hiring process these days looks like. So we might contemplate new staff or existing staff in this, but that's pretty minor. I think I can take this, Mary, and run it by my team about just some more some segregated costs that we might want to break the other costs into. We call that all other.
Okay.
The state, but there probably is a few more categories that make sense to break it into. Courtney?
Thanks, Ben. Mary, could you slide down just a little bit? I think the staffing looks great. Sorry, I needed to read this. Like, do we need, like, say they're gonna buy, I don't know, pencils. This is a really bad example, but do we need to know that they're gonna buy 100 pencils? I feel like that's almost too much information for me. I need more like travel. They're gonna use mileage reimbursement for something, supplies, like office supplies, office materials, printer paper, etc. And then like if they're gonna print stuff, I guess I just need broader categories. Then I don't need to know that they're gonna buy 100 pencils. Is that right?
I agree. I think I can work with Mary and my contracting team to sort of distill. We have limited flexibility on what we can use. I'm not suggesting that we use a DHHS budget form. They're complicated, but I think we can take some, distill it up into some broader categories, and then supplement what we have here. But agree, I think supplies, for example, should just be a line item. It should be supplies. We should give a couple examples of what supplies is, and then there's a dollar amount of what the request is, basically.
Yeah, and then like travel and printing materials or whatever. And then I think also just like giving an opportunity for a budget narrative. It's, usually 2 paragraphs to just explain or expand on what the numbers mean in an application.
Yep, I agree. So like in my head, it would be like that blank column that we have here. So we have like the expense category, then we have the actual description that we identify, and then they'll plug in a dollar amount, and then there's maybe like another notes column or something of where they're describing what the, if our description didn't align perfectly with what they are planning on doing, they can just plug in some more context.
Sounds good. Thanks, Ben.
That all sounds great to me too. And Ben, this was definitely one of the more simplified versions of this. So what I will do, Ben, is I'll translate this into a spreadsheet with the feedback that we've received today and then send that to you. And we can discuss that from there.
Great.
Brendan, are there any components to the budget that you believe are, important for us to include specific to the way the MOU is written for the Recovery Council?
It's a good question. Let me consider that.
Okay.
And I don't want to dwell at this time and bog down the agenda, but it's a good question. Let me revisit that. Are there specific things you have in mind, or just in general?
More generally, I think, again, if adapting this and also with Ben's perspective of state budgets, I think we'll cover most of our bases, but I also know that this is a very unique funding source. And so if there are any particulars of what, our MOU states, and maybe that's more of just in the description of the budget, that we have to emphasize certain points around abatement spending versus just general spending. I guess that's really what it is for me of how we need to incorporate abatement language.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of two things that come to my mind are going to be, caps on, any kind of admin expenses, and, focusing, funding on the approved uses and abatement. But I'll take a closer look at it.
Okay, and may come off as a naive question, but it will be helpful for me. When we're thinking about travel, supplies, all of that, that's all would be included in the like 10 to 15% or whatever rate for the admin cost that we're talking about. Is that correct? No?
No. So let's put a pin in the contracts because we have 20 minutes left here, and I'd like to have a discussion around admin costs and then potential vendor selection or process there, and then back to distribution of funding, the question Courtney had at the beginning. So about 5 minutes on each of those topics. Any really pressing contract or budget items for the application before we move on to admin?
Nope, that's all.
Great. So I think there's the question around the allowability of admin costs. When I think of admin costs, or I think it'd probably be better to stop calling them admin costs and start calling them overhead rate, is basically an overhead rate that is applied from some sort of organization for corporate resources to account for costs that are not easily assignable to a particular program. So I mean, I think a lot of these, 15% for a nonprofit for overhead, basically, the corporate suite, and maybe other costs related to that are not easily assignable would factor into that, or 10% or something like that. But this has been, we've had a couple of conversations around this. The state, for example, there's federal guidance on this that DHHS and other state agencies follow, and it's laid out in somewhat excruciating detail in the Code of Federal Regulations around what is allowable and what is not. But the de facto rate is 10%. But, and it goes up from there, basically if they have a federally approved rate or some other rate that they've agreed to with their sort of funder, and Maine Recovery Council would be the funder in this instance. But Brendan, what else did you want to highlight on this topic?
Mostly that each of the settlements requires a certain percentage, but it's always a different percentage to be spent on abatement. So which sort of inversely caps the amount of money that can be spent on non-abatement activities. And these are at the settlement level, which is different from the memorandum of understanding. The amounts are in the range of 15%. No more than that can be spent by a recipient of the funds for non-abatement activities. And the recipient of the funds includes us. It also, includes any entity that receives the settlement dollars from the defendants. And so the admin costs sort of aggregate across, as you go up levels, from distributees, to, the state up to multiple states and so forth. And so the further away we can stay from that 15% cap, the more flexibility I think we have, the less trouble we run the risk of getting into. The other issue is the MOU doesn't, and maybe this isn't what you're getting at, Ben, the MOU doesn't specifically permit funds to be used for overhead. I'm curious, I would like to know what the subdivisions who receive direct shares are doing, because they're the other party to the MOU. If they have, made decisions about, spending certain percentages on overhead, it may make sense for there to be, some collective understanding of what an acceptable amount for overhead can be within the state. And I think that would be a helpful conversation. So, I definitely hear the argument that overhead is necessary in order to administer these funds. And I think, we just want to make sure that we're all, communicating about what makes sense for that.
So quickly, I believe it was Opportunity Alliance and other larger agencies probably have the same guideline, that within their budget, every program has to contribute to the admin costs, and it is a set and fixed fee. Matter of fact, if I remember the conversation that Wynn had said that if we kept it at like 10%, they couldn't even accept the dollars from us, because again, in order for their agency, the way it's set up, if you're this department, it's 17%. It's 17% admin or whatever that fee is all the way around. And I can certainly have the conversation with Joe and some other CEOs or executive directors to ask if that's true of most agencies. But I'd hate to cut off larger agencies by saying, again, they were very clear that if we can't meet what their standards are, they didn't think they could take the money the way their financial systems are set up. Not our problem, I guess. It's theirs because they can't accept the money, but that's just that. And again, I have to go, so I'm going to quickly say just one thing. One is, if we truly have $8 million that are unspent, my vote would be that we take that and distribute it for the next round equally amongst the 4 pillars. And I can't remember what the other question was. Oh, I think we should have the longer conversation about contracting out and exactly what our needs are with that. I have some real fear that we are going to overburden the staff even more than they're already there. And we need to talk about that some more.
Thanks, Pat. Let's
Ben, can I just, 1 or 2 more things? I would be to Pat's point about sort of expectations from grantees. I would like to hear, how the state approaches that, how when it's making grants, how does it work? I assume I don't know anything about how negotiable that number is from the state's perspective. The other point I want to make, I think Ella has done a bunch of research, but I'm calling her out without warning her that I'm doing this. I think she's done some research into what other states have done as far as at these overhead costs, which, are referred to as different things around the country. And it may be useful for this group to hear at some point, if not now, about how other states are approaching this issue.
Yeah, I'll just say something really quickly about that. Other states in general have assigned just admin and indirect costs as 15% for each of them, or like 20% for admin and then 15% for indirect, or 20% for admin and 10% for indirect. And that's just like a static figure that they assign to all the people who receive funding from them. So those were pretty standard numbers.
Yes. I will say the majority of federal grants that DHHS gets have their overhead rates are allowed to be billed. Not all of them though, and we recently received a couple grants that prohibit overhead rates from being built into the grants. That is unusual, and I've had to figure out where we're going to get funding to cover those because there are real costs there. So it is not always a certainty that there's overhead built in. However, I do think it makes it very challenging, and if no grants built in overhead, then there would be a real problem here. So it's more of an annoyance that some grants don't allow it. That said, these words are fairly technical and not that helpful, but I will share my screen anyway. This is from the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations. 2 CFR 200 is basically the document, the manual of how states need to treat federal dollars. So that's what that means. But it basically, indirect rates are basically costs. This is what I said before, incurred from a common or joint purpose benefiting more than one cost objective that's not readily assignable. So I will come back actually with some examples, because what we're not talking about here is, for example, rent or utility costs. Those are assignable. It's very easy to assign how much a vendor might be paying for their lease and being able to assign a cost out to that. But this is mostly for, like what I was saying, the corporate suite. There's other things that are probably not included in here, but would be included in admin costs, like payroll taxes. If they're going to hire someone else, they're going to have to buy workers' comp, and their insurance is probably going to go up, and their payroll taxes are going to increase. So we're going to have to take that into account. There are 3 ways that DHHS, which is codified in the 2 CFR 2 Part 200, approves overhead rates. They have the vendor has a federally approved negotiated rate. So these are probably larger vendors like this, like a lot of the universities in the state have a federally approved rate. Then B is a negotiated rate between the pass-through entity, which in this instance would be DHHS, and the subrecipient, which is the hundreds of contracted providers that DHHS administers through, or C, just the de minimis 10%. So I do think I don't mind sort of defaulting to 10% right off the bat, because I think it would be clean, and then allow them to itemize some of the other costs for admin, such as like payroll taxes and any utility costs or things like that in their budgets. I would anticipate some of the applications that we get would not include a lot of over admin costs, because what they're applying for is a small proportion of their total revenue, but in some cases it might be warranted. Courtney?
Thanks. I would also really like to default to 10%, and here's my reason why. So talking about like the TOA grant that we just made, or we are making, we allocated $175,000 to TOA. 8 organizations are getting $20,000 of that money for a total of $160,000. And $15,000 we're saying should go to administrative cost. They want 15% of that top line though. If we were to give them 15% of $175,000, that's $26,250. I have very deep concern if more money is going to administrative overhead for a grant recipient than is going to programming, right? Like each of those smaller organizations are getting $20,000 and then the parent org is getting $26,000 does not sit right with me. At 10%, that's 17.5. I get a little more comfortable there because it's at least less than what programming is actually getting. And then also those 8 orgs are also going to need a percentage of that to go to overhead. So $20,000 at 10%. I have a spreadsheet open. That's $2,000. So now what is actually going to programming is $144,000 out of the 175 for a total of $31,000 going to overhead out of 175. It's just like it sucks it up real quick and makes me super nervous. Especially for these like parent orgs that are sending it out to smaller orgs. So that was a long way to say I'd really like to keep it at 10%.
Yeah, I think there's probably appreciate all of those comments, Courtney. I think there's real efficiencies from our perspective to keeping it at a flat rate and applying it universally. I think there might be, like, I don't doubt some larger, more sophisticated organizations might have complicated approaches to spreading how their indirect goes from a particular grant source, but I have no doubt that they have figured out, had to piece together solutions to what happens when they don't get overhead or something like that. And I don't think some of the smaller organizations we might be doing business with, this is probably not going to really impact them directly.
Yeah, the small organizations like myself don't even know what overhead is, and we don't charge it right, and therefore none of our staff have health care. So
yes, I wasn't
better at it.
So I don't think we need to decide today, but is there other thoughts on admin as I blew past my 5-minute mark here on this discussion? So I think we'll do like Pat offered to talk to Joe a little bit more about the TOA experience. I will follow up with my team. I think sounds like Ella and maybe Mary can do some more research exactly on maybe what other subrecipients and municipalities and other states are doing. And we can, it sounds like though, you know, at least rising to the top here is maybe a flat rate at something like 10% makes sense. And that, I mean, we can't go much higher than 10% anyway because of the 15% threshold that's built into the settlement agreements themselves. So we have limited discretion, I think, regardless. I wanted to have a fuller conversation about a vendor. I do think we're going to need a vendor here to help administer things, but can we just suffice to say for now that, Ella, I think you've been doing some research on this. Can we maybe carve out a more sufficient amount of time at the next finance committee meeting for this discussion, maybe 20-25 minutes if you've been, and you could present on what you've been thinking about. I had a conversation with Pat many months ago with one provider in the state as well, but we didn't follow up with them. But does that sound good in terms of capacity for hiring a vendor for the Maine Recovery Council support?
Yeah, that sounds good. I have some materials I can present at the next meeting too, to sort of move that along. So yeah.
Fantastic, thank you.
And Ben, just one request along those lines. One thing that I think would be helpful is to get guidance, you know, from people on this committee about what kinds of work or what are the tasks that we need to anticipate are going to be needed for contract management that would, result in, that would bring us to needing a vendor. what's the work that we need to, that we're not anticipating now? What are you doing? What are other agencies doing that we're not, anticipating right now?
Yep, I think that's good that we can think about. Some of this is one-time stuff that we're doing and we won't have to do again because we will blaze the path for it. But some of this stuff is ongoing and we don't even know what we don't know yet because we're not in like that ongoing phase yet.
Yeah, and just the point is, the Attorney General's office isn't a grant-making entity, so we don't have that kind of infrastructure that, other agencies have or entities have. Thanks.
So Courtney, let's spend the next 2 to 3 minutes on what you raised previously. I'm just distribution of funding, which we've previously discussed, I think, at least in some detail at the February committee meeting, like how to use the remaining funds. Did you want to tee this up or did you want me to?
Yeah, I mean, I think the grant committee was looking for some directions and recommendations from this committee about how to distribute the money that is currently available to the Maine Recovery Council across or between the 4 pillars: prevention, treatment, recovery, and harm reduction, as they work to set up a grant proposal. So, I mean, I think the options are we pick a number for each pillar or we distribute it evenly. I don't know. I think that's the 2 different options. You pick those are the only 2 options. You distribute them evenly or you pick different numbers for different pillars, adding up to probably 8 million in year 1 and maybe 12 million in year 2.
Yeah, something around there.
Like 20 million is what you've got for the next 2 years. That's the tee up.
Great. My perspective on this, and I've talked to Pat a little bit about it because she has flagged it a couple times for me. I feel like we've done some prioritization work here at the committee at the council level, and then we also are on the verge of submitting an application. And I think we need to let the people, the providers and organizations come in with their funding of what their projects, and we shouldn't be too prescriptive about, we think harm reduction should get 1.5 times more than treatment, for example, or something like that. It feels a little, I don't know if I would be in a position to make declarations like that without understanding who's prepared to deliver what services using Maine Recovery Council funding. But that's just my perspective. Paul?
I would like to see us do this as a guidance as opposed to a strict rule. So I think a reasonable guidance would be that all 4 pillars get equal amount, and then follow it as we put these grants through and say, if the first 4 grants were all under treatment, then the next grant we might want to put under one of the other categories, and do that as a guidance. But if at the end we have, a whole bunch of people asking for money for prevention and no one asking for money for treatment, I don't want to hold back that money.
Agree. Someone else have their hand up?
I did, and I'll be very brief. Well, I think I know that part of the conversation on next Thursday is around this. So if the finance committee, I think, even is just able to provide a recommendation for the total amount for the grants, that would be beneficial. And then as a full committee, full council, we can have the discussion around the allocation per pillar. And I want to note that as the first round of grants, I think there's a lot of lessons that we'll learn and feedback that we'll get both from both internally and externally, and that learning what gaps exist could be very beneficial for us.
Thanks, Mary. Courtney?
Thanks, Ben. I would like to evenly distribute the money across the 4 pillars. I think that treatment's going to cost more than recovery or even harm reduction. but I also don't feel comfortable being like prevention's more important than harm reduction by giving it a number or any other version of that makeup. And so I would like it to be evenly distributed. I think that we should do $5 million per pillar. Because there's about $21 million over the next 2 years, and then we can have $1 million set aside for emergent issues or opportunities. That's how I'll say it.
Yeah, I agree with most of that. I think I don't want to artificially determine which a pillar should get more funding than another one, but that our intent is to fund all of them equally. I think once we get applications in and we're scoring and looking at that, I think it's immediately, it's not going to come out exactly equal. And what I hear this conversation morphing into is whether or not we should be reserving that funding for a particular pillar, because it is within the harm reduction category, but we didn't get enough applications that we want to award for that. So whether or not we're spending that funding on other activities or if we're reserving it for harm reduction, for example. So we can think about that a little bit, but I'm not hearing any opposition to, at least with the intent of coming up with, of treating all 4 pillars equally at the outset.
I would agree that there should be equal allocations in our intention, and that there should be specific discussion when we get those applications back if we are going to sort of change course. If we're going to prioritize putting more money into one of the pillars, that should be an intentional decision we make as a council.
Okay.
Question on Mary's question around, does this committee have a recommendation of how much money is available? I'm looking to you more so than me. Do you feel comfortable at the spending of $20 million over the next 2 years, or would you go a little higher, a little lower? Where do you feel comfortable?
We have that available. I think it's right around there, and I think budgets typically underspend, and we have more money in our account, so we're not like going to go negative, for example, where you would just be. I think I'm generally okay with that $20 million, acknowledging that 12 million of it is only really available for next year. So,
Yeah, by the time we get this grant application out, scored, and be hitting the bank, it will be next year.
Yep. But I will, I think that takes into the school set aside, that leaves no funding for a vendor, for example, which will be, if we hired a vendor to do this, it would be a team of people doing it. It would be a few $100,000 at least, I think, annually to administer this. So
A school set aside, because I thought that was already removed out.
the school set aside's included in those numbers. What I'm talking about is a vendor to help administer contracts and run operations here for us a little bit.
Okay, but there's about 21 million total, right?
Yes.
Okay, got it, thanks.
Yeah, so I do think something around 20 million makes sense, but so if I think, Mary, you can use that for the program and grants committee, and we can try to firm that up, or we can talk about, I can brief about this conversation at the council meeting, at the next council meeting. I said I wasn't going to go long. We went long. It's going to happen every time. But we're going to end the conversation here. It was productive 90 minutes. Appreciate everyone's attendance and participation, and good thoughts. So if you have other agenda items or have other things to add, please let me know. I can add it to the next council meeting. Otherwise, we will follow up on the things we discussed today.
Real quick, Ben, your next meeting's going to be the last Tuesday in May, right? Because of Memorial Day?
Did we previously, sounds reasonable, but let's follow
You said
up.
that, but like 8 months ago or something, so I wanted to check in.
Okay, we'll talk about it.
Okay.
It certainly won't be on that Monday. It will not be on Memorial Day. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Bye, thanks.